Names carried by only a few hundred people worldwide. Names tied to clans so small, so remote, that for most of history nobody outside their own glen had heard of them. For generations, these names were treated as folklore, colorful footnotes in tartan shops and clan society newsletters, more myth than history. Nobody expected them to hold up under a microscope. Then genetic testing arrived in the Highlands, and something strange happened. Some of these obscure, half-forgotten names did not dissolve into genetic noise the way historians assumed they would. In a handful of cases, they held together, tightly, improbably, across oceans and centuries. And that raised an uncomfortable question for anyone who had ever been told their clan tartan was mostly Victorian invention. What if, underneath the romanticized version of Highland history, something real had actually survived? This is the story of 12 rare Scottish surnames, the clans behind them, and what the DNA does, and does not, confirm about the bloodlines people have spent centuries believing in. The accepted history of the Highland clan system is, on its surface, straightforward. A clan was understood as an extended kin group, descended, at least in theory, from a single founding ancestor, bound together by loyalty to a chief, a shared name, a shared territory, and eventually a shared tartan. Names like McCrae, McNabb, McLaughlin, McFarlane, Macaulay, McGillivray, MacNichol, McQueen, Muckbean, MacCrimmon, MacCodrum, and MacPhee all carried this same implied promise, that if you bore the name, you were, in some real biological sense, a descendant of the clan's founder. Historians have long been skeptical of taking that promise too literally. Clan membership, especially by the later medieval and early modern period, was not purely a matter of blood. Smaller family groups attached themselves to larger, more powerful clans for protection, adopting the chief's surname without being biologically related at all. Tenants took their landlord's name. Defeated groups were absorbed into victorious ones. The clan, in other words, functioned as much as a political and military alliance as a family tree. For most surnames, historians assumed, the biological thread connecting a modern bearer of the name to a medieval founder had almost certainly been broken, diluted, or fabricated somewhere along the way. That was the stable version of the story, reasonable, cautious, and widely accepted. The first crack appeared in local records long before any DNA was involved. Certain small clans, the MacCrimmons of Skye, hereditary pipers to the MacLeods, the MacCodrums of the Outer Hebrides, seal herders tied to obscure island folklore, the MacNichols, an old name predating even the MacLeods on Lewis and Skye, showed something unusual in parish and testament records. Their numbers stayed small for centuries, concentrated in the same narrow strips of land, generation after generation, almost never appearing outside their home territory. Larger clans spread, fractured, and scattered across Scotland and eventually the world. These small ones barely moved. That kind of geographic tightness is unusual. It suggested either extreme cultural isolation or something more biologically continuous than historians were comfortable assuming. This is where genetics entered the story, and it entered through a very specific tool, the Y chromosome. Passed from father to son with only slow, trackable mutations, the Y chromosome behaves almost like a name of its own, a biological surname, inherited alongside the cultural one, generation after generation, largely undisturbed by the genetic blending that erases most ancestry within a handful of generations. If a clan name had been passed down through an unbroken paternal line since the medieval period, the men who carried it today should, in theory, still share a recognizable Y chromosome signature. If the name had instead been adopted independently by unrelated families, through fosterage, tenancy, or political absorption, the Y DNA should be scattered, unrelated, revealing multiple biological origins hiding under one cultural name. Researchers running Highland clan DNA projects expected mostly the second outcome. Scotland had endured too much displacement, clearances, famine, forced emigration, centuries of political reshuffling, for tidy single ancestor lineages to have survived intact. And for most of the larger clans, that expectation held. Names like Campbell, MacDonald, and Stewart showed exactly what you would expect from names that thousands of unrelated families had adopted over time: wide genetic diversity, multiple independent paternal lines, no single dominant signature. But the 12 rarer names told a different story. Not identical to each other, but strikingly consistent within themselves. That was not a contradiction of the old skepticism. It was a signal, and it forced a widening of the question. Because inside several of these smaller clans, particularly MacCrimmon, MacNichol, MacCodrum, and McQueen, the majority of tested men carrying the surname shared closely related Y chromosome haplotypes, clustering around what researchers call a most recent common ancestor, a single man, biologically, from whom a disproportionate number of living name-bearers appeared to descend. The story did not collapse into myth. It widened into something researchers had to take seriously. If you find this kind of quiet detective work through half-forgotten names compelling, this is exactly the kind of story worth sticking around for, because Highland history is still full of these small, overlooked threads. Researchers laid out several possible explanations for the pattern, careful not to declare any one of them proven. The first was a genuine founder effect. A single progenitor, in a small and geographically isolated population, whose sons and grandsons simply out-reproduced or outlasted unrelated men bearing the same surname, until the biological line came to dominate the name almost entirely. Isolated island and glen populations with limited outside marriage for generations are exactly the conditions under which a founder effect becomes genetically visible centuries later. The second explanation involved strict hereditary occupation. The MacCrimmons, for instance, were not simply a clan. They were, for roughly 200 years, the hereditary pipers of Clan MacLeod, training at a legendary piping college on Skye, with the position passed rigidly from father to son. A hereditary craft tied that tightly to lineage may have reinforced paternal continuity far more strongly than an ordinary surname would. The third explanation was more cautious still: sampling and survivorship. Rare surnames, by definition, have fewer living bearers today, which means modern DNA databases may be capturing a smaller, more genetically concentrated pool almost by accident. A statistical illusion of purity created simply because there are so few branches left to sample from. Serious geneticists hold these explanations in tension rather than picking a winner. What the data supports is narrower than a clean, singular bloodline reaching back untouched to a mythic clan founder, but it is still remarkable. It suggests that for a handful of small, historically isolated Highland names, the biological thread is unusually intact, in a way the larger, more famous clans simply cannot claim. The most significant evidence came from an expanded comparative Highland surname project, which moved beyond isolated family tests into a broader panel, cross-referencing Y chromosome data from hundreds of men against parish records, testament archives, and known clan territories stretching back to the 16th century, then measuring the genetic diversity of rare clan names against common lowland surnames as a control. The contrast was the important part. Common surnames scattered exactly as expected, the biological signal long since diluted by intermarriage and independent adoption. The dozen rare Highland names did not scatter the same way. Some clustered so tightly that researchers described the pattern as resembling a single, deep-rooted family tree rather than a loosely affiliated political alliance wearing one name. Here is the twist, and it is not the simple, satisfying version the title implies. The DNA does not hand every McQueen or MacNichol a guaranteed, unbroken line straight to a medieval clan founder standing on a hillside in an origin legend. What it reveals instead is stranger, and in some ways more moving, that in a small number of Highland clans, biology and identity stayed remarkably fused for far longer than the wider, better-known clans ever managed, not because of romance or myth, but because of geographic isolation, hereditary craft, and small population size acting together like an accidental vault, preserving something most of Scotland's larger clans lost centuries ago. Not proof that every tartan-wearing descendant today is biologically pure. Something closer to proof that a few small, overlooked corners of the Highlands functioned, unintentionally, as genetic time capsules, protected not by tradition alone, but by isolation itself. And that matters for far more than 12 surnames. It suggests that clan identity in Scotland was never one single kind of thing. Some clans were vast political confederations, absorbing unrelated families under a shared banner for protection and power. Others, smaller and more remote, may have remained something closer to what the old stories always claimed, an actual extended family, biologically continuous, simply because history never gave them the chance to blend. The old narrative treated all clans the same way, as either fully mythical or fully biological. The genome suggests neither extreme is right. Some clans were built. A few, quietly, were inherited. Picture one of these places now. The Trotternish Ridge on Skye at dusk, black basalt cliffs falling toward a gray sea, wind moving through grass that has not changed shape in 400 years. Somewhere below, the ruins of a piping college where boys once studied a craft passed down like a bloodline, father teaching son, for 2 centuries without interruption. No monument marks exactly where the line began. The wind erased the names from the stone long ago. But somewhere out in the world, in the cells of a man who has never set foot on that island, a fragment of that same unbroken chain may still be quietly repeating itself, one father to one son, the way it has since before the college existed at all. That is the real discovery hiding under the dramatic title. Not a fairy tale of guaranteed noble bloodlines. Something rarer and more fragile. Evidence that in a few isolated corners of the Highlands, identity and biology never fully separated the way they did almost everywhere else in Scotland. The clearances scattered the people. Emigration scattered the names across continents. But in a handful of these small lineages, the paternal thread appears to have survived the scattering almost intact, not because anyone planned it, but because isolation, by accident, did the work that record-keeping usually fails to do. The old story said a clan name was either myth or guarantee. The genome suggests something quieter than both, that history, when a population stays small and isolated long enough, sometimes writes itself directly into the body, waiting centuries to be read. If a story like this makes you look differently at your own family name, that is worth sitting with, and worth subscribing for, because there is still far more hidden in the Highlands than the tartan shops ever told us. The clans are gone in the political sense. The chiefs no longer command armies, and the glens that once held hundreds now hold a handful of houses and a great deal of silence. But somewhere, in the quiet biology of a few small, nearly forgotten names, something older than the clan system itself may still be quietly holding on. Not a legend, but a lineage, waiting in the DNA for someone to finally ask the right question.